Before we begin today's program, I want to start by wishing a very happy birthday to one of our sponsors who's here today, Mr. Ron Rudick. Ron, stand up, please. Happy birthday, Ron. Okay, to begin this morning's program, I would like to introduce once again Dr. Terrence Campbell.
Thank you, Joe. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Demosthenes Lorandos. Demosthenes and I have known each other for more than 15 years now. We have worked together. We have presented together at various conferences, and we have written together. Now, in the beginning, the writing part did not always go well. Demosthenes was the master of the run-on sentence. He used periods as if each one cost him $1. Our arguments in his office would sometimes send his secretary hiding for cover. Sometimes our arguments would become so intense, his secretary thought that maybe she should call Demosthenes' wife, and she could come to the office and mediate the confrontation that was going on. Demosthenes is typically a warm, caring, compassionate person, but sometimes he can be borderline cruel. He calls me Goldilocks. And these people are laughing at you, not me. I call him Sweetlets because of the very nice things he says to ill-informed mental health professionals when he cross-examines them. The question and answer exchange might go something like Demosthenes asking an ill-informed psychologist, "Did you know that I'm also a psychologist?" And the intimidated witness says, "Yes, yes." Next question would be, "Have you read anything that I have written?" Witness says, "No." And the following question is, "By the time this deposition is complete, perhaps you're going to wish that you had read things that I had written." Demosthenes has made exceedingly important contributions to the field of mental health and the law. I can remember numerous occasions where Richard Gardner would seek his help and his counsel as Richard was navigating the many, many minefields that he faced. And my most significant impression of Demosthenes is what I have learned about him by talking to his clients. I've encountered clients of Demosthenes who are just overwhelmed by god-awful situations that have fallen upon them. But yet these are people who will say to me, "I still have my sense of hope." Doc Demosthenes gave that back to me. I can get myself out of the vicious cycle that I was in because Doc helped me to see what I was doing to myself. So his capacities for restoring hope and confidence in his clients are quite remarkable. And at this point, I give you my very special friend, who I respect and love, Demosthenes Lorandos.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I'm pleased that Dr. Campbell did not check me into the boards as he's fond of doing. My job is to talk to you and to talk to all the folks out there in continuing education land about parental alienation processes, parental alienation disorder, parental alienation syndrome, parental alienation chopped liver, I don't care what you call it, and whether or not the concept in its various forms is in fact scientific. I'm going to draw upon a sense of what science is and describe whether parental alienation is scientific, because Dr. Bone and I, having survived the New School for Social Research in the 60s and 70s, have a vague sense that we are in fact scientists. And as many of your presenters who are PhDs in psychology and other fields and psychiatrists will probably, no doubt, be seen as scientists, we have a sense of what science is, and I'm particularly amused at all of the folks that say PAS is not scientific, because all of them are non-scientists. And I find it delightful to have an opportunity to talk about how PAS may be or can be seen as scientific. And first I'm going to talk about what the main detractors, when people say, unless there's some nasty old trial judge from Oshkosh who doesn't know anything about science whatsoever, says, well, you know, it's just junk science, and I don't think that that's got anything to do with anything. Aside from those folks who have little or no education in science, let's talk about the three. First of all, we're going to talk about the three main detractors that are cited by folks who say PAS is not scientific. The three main folks whose work is cited when people try to say that parental alienation syndrome is just junk science are a law student, a social worker, and a law professor. Unfortunately, people read what they say and think, oh, wow, this is, yeah, well, golly, it's real scientific problems with this, and never look underneath what it is that they're actually saying, what their analysis is, or who they really are. Let's start. One of the articles from back in the 90s that cited routinely to describe Gardner's work as being unscientific was written by a law student who apparently had no background whatsoever in science. And she said that, and she wrote a note, which is a non-peer-reviewed student article published in the Law Review where she went to school. And she said that Gardner uses a sexual abuse legitimacy scale to diagnose parental alienation syndrome, and says that Gardner's work hadn't been peer-reviewed at all. Of course, in order to say that, she had to ignore zillions of peer-reviewed articles and work that Gardner did. She went on to say that she attempted to refute Gardner's work by saying that Gardner only said that child sexual abuse claims in custody are contrived, and never said that they had any legitimacy. And to further her argument, she called upon research by a psychologist, social worker. Unfortunately, this is a notable detractor named Kathleen Fowler, who we'll talk about in a minute. But because Sherry had no ability to understand what the quality of scientific review really would look like or how it would be done, she just cited to some other detractor and suggested that therefore her opinions about Gardner should have some weight. So, unfortunately, when we look at Sherry's work in this particular article, we see that she thoroughly misunderstands base rate. When we say that, when Sherry says that to suggest that there's a high degree of contrived false allegations in the process of high conflict custody cases like parental alienation syndrome cases, we should certainly understand base rate and realize that there's good research out there to suggest that most allegations, particularly of sexual abuse, tend to be unsubstantiated, tend to be false. There's a tremendous amount of false allegations out there. That's not to say that sexual abuse doesn't happen. God, it's terrible, and we would like to send midgets in spandex with chainsaws after the folks that perpetrate sexual abuse on children. That's my suggestion for reforming the death penalty in the United States. Midgets in yellow spandex suits with those Mexican wrestling masks with chainsaws on live television. That'd make it a deterrent. And it'd probably be an award-winning show. At least it'd be better than Dancing with the Stars. But be that as it may, when you really look at the base rate of the phenomena of allegations of sexual abuse, you see that Darrow and Mitchell, Flango, looked at the number of cases that are unsubstantiated or are seen to be false or can't be proved. They outweigh the ones that are. And so if you look at a base rate phenomenon, you would certainly understand that if the majority just generally are seen to be not true, then do we expect that there are going to be a higher frequency of true ones in the context of two parents that are being scrutinized by a court system? That's just frankly silly, and I'll take questions later. And
define base rate, because I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, and you would expect that if she understood base rate, in other words, what is the general level of a phenomena in a population at a particular time, she wouldn't make a comment like that, but she does not. Base rate, here you go, refers to the class probabilities that exist in a certain data set. Okay? Now, if we take a behavioral example, in 4 or 5-year-olds, what's good quality research indicate about the base rate of just general lying behavior? Well, we see from 2 different scientifically scrutinized research articles that you know, with 4 and 5-year-olds, it's a fairly common phenomenon. Well, if we use a base rate illustration as simple as this one, and let's say sex abuse is on the top, it happened, or it didn't happen, okay? And let's say behavior X and the lack of behavior X are on the side. People like Sherry and people who tend to be non-scientists say things like, because Junior's lying behavior has increased dramatically, that's consistent with sexual abuse having happened. Or because little Susie is bedwetting again, that's consistent with sexual abuse. Well, if you understand base rate, you know that fortunately sexual abuse is a pretty rare phenomenon. And if you understand recurrence of bedwetting or lying, recurrence of bedwetting, you understand that fortunately we sort of get through that, and we're, you know, I mean, most of us aren't bedwetters, and it tends to go away. So if you look at the way in which base rate develops in examples such as these, you see that you got to move those lines dramatically. It's not as simple as 50-50, it happened or it didn't happen, and 50-50, the bedwetting again is happening. Nope. It looks as though the true positives are way up there in that left-hand corner. And everything else, 95%, indicate it probably didn't happen and they're probably not lying again or bedwetting again, whatever you throw in there. So if you understand base rate, like the law student didn't, you realize that saying something as silly as sexual abuse allegations in divorce being said to be usually false is terrible and ridiculous. You see that they don't understand base rate. So then we go on to the law professor. Now, Carol Brooke in UC Davis, if anyone that's been to UC Davis, you know that it's out there in the middle of a rather smelly area of California where all the cows are, and it's kind of flat and hot and boring, but, you know, so they don't have a whole lot to do out there, and they think up things like Carol Brooke thinks up. Now, Brooke, who apparently has no background in science whatsoever, wrote that Gardner coined the term parental alienation syndrome in 1985 in order to describe his clinical impressions of cases he believed involved false allegations of child sexual abuse. Okay, well, let's look at what Gardner said about that in 1985. He said, "I have introduced the term PAS to refer to a disturbance in which children are obsessed with deprecation and criticism of a parent, denigration that is unjustified and or exaggerated." Okay, so let's change what we say Gardner actually said, and we'll start our review that way. So Brooke goes on to imply that Gardner believed that sexual abuse allegations in divorce cases were automatically false. Of course, that's not what he said. And then she implies that Gardner automatically assumes evidence of false allegations when a custodial parent is claiming abuse, seeks professional help or validation. Of course, that's not what he said either. And she implies that Johnston's research on less troubled children can be used to refute Gardner's observations on far more contentious cases. That doesn't seem to work either. And then she claims that parental alienation is being admitted into courts so that kids will be placed with abusive parents. Well, gee, that wasn't, I mean, Gardner was a child psychiatrist who worked for decades to try to help little children improve their lives, and that doesn't seem to work either. Now, to justify many of her opinions about what's going on with Gardner, Brooke refers, as any non-scientist would, to the research performed by one Ms. Karen Winner. And if we look closely at the research, of course, the research was a newspaper article, not a peer-reviewed journal like the one, the esteemed journal that Dr. Sauber edits, but a newspaper as her source for the scientific reliability of her opinion. She cites a newspaper by non-scientist, article by non-scientist Karen Winner. Now, it turns out that Karen, the quote, investigative reporter, is a stringer. In other words, she sends stuff in to get paid for, or sometimes not paid, to be published, and she's not really a paid reporter at all. But she is. She did a study that was commissioned by the California Protective Parents Association. Okay, if you examine who the Protective Parents Association is, you see that it's a bunch of folks who are on the wrong side of a custody decision in the California court and get really angry about it and form an association. Of course, if you look further at Karen Winner, this research that law professor Brooke, who's a non-scientist, cites to, you see that Karen has a website, and Karen's website describes how to debunk parental alienation syndrome. So the charming thing about Professor Brooke is people rely upon her work without any real investigation into what it is that she's actually relying upon. First, she's got no education in science. Secondly, she has no present ability to evaluate scientific claims. I don't think she'd understand the difference between construct validity and inter-rater reliability if her life depended upon it. And she certainly cites the sources that Dr. Sauber would laugh at her and throw her paper in the trash. I don't think he'd even bother to write her a thanks but no thanks letter. He'd probably be laughing so hard if she tried to submit an article to his journal. So that's a second detractor in the quality of her work. Then we have my favorite from the University of Michigan, Kathleen Fowler. Now, the University of Michigan is sort of like the Berkeley of the Midwest in the United States. You know, if you shake any tree out, will fall 2 radicals and a therapist. Well, Kathleen Fowler, and this is a wonderful picture of her. She doesn't look like that. This is not a good picture of me. I don't look this bad. I look better than this. But Dr. Fowler, she has a doctoral degree in social work and social psychology. They put it together in this interesting program at the University of Michigan. Well, she's a director of the Family Assessment Clinic at the University of Michigan, or at least she was when they were still letting her play with real people. And she trained social workers as to what to do, and Dr. Fowler published several things about how Dr. Gardner was incorrect about child sexual abuse and about parental alienation and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at Fowler's actual work. Not what Fowler says about what she does, but what Fowler actually does. And it almost never, ever happens that an independent team will go and take a good hard look at what somebody actually does, particularly somebody, in this case, who's critical of the concept of parental alienation syndrome. Well, there was a case in Michigan where Dr. Fowler and her little minions involved themselves in a parental alienation syndrome case, a very difficult case where a mom convinced her daughters that their dad had sexually abused them. So where did they go for help? They went to Dr. Fowler and her clinic. Okay, well, Fowler, because I don't know why, but she puts everything she did on videotape. Well, in the process of appealing the judgment, the court said, oh yes, Dad, you're just a terrible person, you can never see your girls again, and you're terrible and horrible, and Mom won the custody battle and all that. So then an appeal happened, and in the process of an appeal, the Michigan court created a special panel to review Dr. Fowler. Remember, we're talking about her because she's one of those detractors that says PAS is not scientific. Okay, so they took a special panel, and how do they compose this special panel? Well, in the States, when the trial court does a custody decision, it can be appealed to an appellate level court, sort of a mid-level court. And then, if that doesn't get you anywhere, or if there's something wrong, then it can go to a higher court. In most states, it's called the Supreme Court. It's very much like the court system in Canada. Well, so this special panel that was created to review Fowler took the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, one of the best judges in the appellate level court, and one of the best judges in the trial level court. So they had all 3 courts represented. These folks wrote a 49-page opinion, reviewed 9 hours of Fowler and her group and all of her written work. And the panel said that they completed a painstaking review of the entire record. They said, we watched the videotaped interviews, and there were 9 hours of them in their entirety. In addition, the court reviewed the testimony of several highly qualified experts who critiqued the interviews. Now, okay, who were the experts that critiqued what Dr. Fowler, remember, we're talking about her because she says PAS isn't scientific, and we're taking a look at what she actually does rather than what she says she does. Well, who were these people that critiqued Fowler other than these judges? Well, scientists. The former chief psychologist of one of the county circuit courts, clinic, another retired chief psychologist from another county's court clinic, and the former president of the American Psychiatric Association. Oh, okay. So we've got the best judges they can find from 3 different levels of courts. They got a former president of the Psychiatric Association and 2 former chief psychologists of court clinics who see hundreds of highly contested custody cases and supervise all the folks in their clinics that see hundreds of these. That's who reviewed Fowler's work. Well, as I said, It was a Chief Justice, a Court of Appeals judge, and a trial court judge. And the court said that their independent conclusion was that when Fowler was interviewing these girls about the allegation of sexual abuse in this highly contested, arguably parental alienation syndrome case, what Fowler did was to create interviews that were suggestive, coercive, and untrustworthy. They went on to say that there were numerous inaccuracies and deficiencies in their work. They quoted Dr. Benedict, the former president of the American Psychiatric Association, who said that these couldn't even meet basic standard of care. The two other doctors that I've referred to found coaching, bias, slanted questions, and failure to look at any alternative hypothesis. Now, in Benedict's opinion, she said that after reviewing a videotaped interview of Fowler with a child, Benedict testified she did not believe the interview met the standards of unbiased interviews, and she stated that the interview was replete with leading questions. What's the worst thing you can do with a little kid and you want to find out, has somebody hurt you? Leading questions. What's the next worst thing you can do? Repeated questions. Did your daddy hurt you? 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 I guess. Aha! We got it. And gave the child a rare opportunity to say what actually happened. Now, of the two court clinic psychologists that had seen hundreds of cases of abuse, one said that, quote, the younger child was being coached, rehearsed, and prepared to tell what the interviewer and the defendant, the mother, want her to say. The children were set up verbally several times about what they were going to have to testify to. The interviewer undressed the male doll and fumbled with the penis. While the older child was asked leading, wait, PAS is not scientific. I mean, Kathleen Fowler says so. And asked penis-related questions, which provided visual as well as auditory markers. The interviewer showed the child both visually and auditorially what she should say. Oh, okay. What happened to finding out what happened? The second doctor that ran a court clinic, supervised hundreds of lower-level psychologists and social workers, hundreds of cases done by lower-level psychologists and social workers involving highly contested custody circumstances, said the interviews asked slanted, one-sided questions that were designed to obtain only the information that was consistent with the hypothesis that the children had been sexually abused. Okay, boy, that's what a scientist does. Let's find it, Bill. Come on. Don't look at anything that says it isn't there. Let's only look for what's there. The interviewers did not ask questions that could obtain information that disconfirmed their expectations. The interviewer's questions created imagery in the child's mind and can result in the problem that the questions create the child's imagination. Okay. After doing therapy with children for decades, since the 60s, you know and I know that it's difficult enough for little girls to deal with boys in the world. Difficult enough. I mean, come on. We're, boys, hormones, we can be difficult. But to put images in their heads, to supply them with ideas that their daddy's bad, and their daddy did bad things to them, is obscene. Okay, so those are the detractors. Now let's talk about science. I'm going to use what Dr. Campbell and I fought about for years to try to put in fairly succinct terms, because lawyers don't think the way mental health professionals do. And Dr. Campbell informed me over and over and over again as we were writing the text cross-examining experts in the behavioral sciences that I had to speak like a regular person. Just because I went to law school didn't give me the right to not speak like a regular person any longer. So we had to translate 3 important cases in the United States because they talked about science. Now, why am I talking about cases from the United States? I'm talking about cases, and I'll talk about Mohan in a few minutes, from the United States, because these cases were all reactions to big money judgments won against big corporations. Now, we know in Canada and we know in the United States that the law develops as cases come along. Okay? Well, if there are cases about some poor schnook that gets falsely arrested and falsely convicted, law doesn't develop much there. If there are cases about terrible, horrible divorces and kids being eaten alive, they don't much care about those either. But if it's a big corporation that has to spend a lot of money, whoa, they're right there on top of it. So Daubert, Joyner, and Kumho Tyer were all about big corporations that had to spend a lot of money after the juries awarded the victims damages. And the court said, whoa, wait, there was junk science in there. That's why the victims got the money. Arguably, that might have been true, but it caused the people in the states to reform the way in which experts get to testify and change the way science is viewed. Now, in the States and in many places in Canada, science comes into court, as it should, when we're trying to talk about, is PAS scientific? Did they really know what they were doing when it happened? Would mommy be better than daddy as a single parent, etc.? It's important that science get into court. Well, usually the judges and legislators have a view of science that's sort of 20th century. You know, it's old stuff, back in the 20s. Their philosophy of science is informed by an idea about what science is from the 1920s. Daubert, Kumho, and Joyner at least brings people up to 50 years behind the times. If we think about what science is and we are informed by feminist epistemology, for example, we realize that Daubert, Kumho, and Joyner are about 50 years behind the times, but at least it's better than it has been before. So it got so bad in American courts that cases came along in which the trial judges had to become gatekeepers. Nobody gets, like Fowler, gets to come in, or Bruck, or law student Wood, gets to come in and testify unless their methodology and their reasoning was seen to be scientifically valid, okay? And the judge has to focus solely on the principles and methodology of their science. And reliability and validity are key touchstones for the evaluation process. The court has to focus on, did the person that wants to be an expert, did they create hypotheses? Did they test these hypotheses? These are key questions that have to be answered before they can waltz in and talk to a jury or talk to a judge about who'd be better, mommy or daddy. Empiricism has to be used. Testability. The methods and procedures of science are critical to this evaluation. The psychologists, the psychiatrists, the proposed experts must know the datum of their discipline. If you're a licensed plumber, to keep your license, you really have to know about copper, PVC, vent traps, all sorts of important sanitary issues, pressure, etc. If you don't know that, you can't be a plumber. If you're a cosmetologist, you really need to know how to avoid cutting their ear off. You know, you really need to know how to shave people appropriately. You need to know what hygienic processes there are for sterilizing your stuff. Okay? If you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist, you need to know the datum of your discipline. Well, you need to know what are the scientific tenets and the basic data of psychology. If you don't know the datum of your discipline, you can't testify as an expert. Golly, what about Brooke and Wood and Fowler? I wonder if they know the datum of their, oh, well, forget it. Reliability analysis, validity analysis is key. Experts can't just waltz into court and say, I'm an expert, I've been qualified 600 times. That's called Ipsy-Dixit. Doesn't work anymore. We know that methodology and the expert have to be analyzed, their methodology and who they are and what they know have to be analyzed together. The expert has to be reliable as well as their methodology. Validity of the expert's qualifications and the reliability of their proposed testimony has to be looked at. There has to be a valid connection to the pertinent facts. These are the tenets of science as it applies in legal determinations. The scientist, the expert, must use the same intellectual rigor in their analysis for the court that they use in their work that they would try to submit to a journal like Dr. Sauber's. If it doesn't meet scientific rigor, if the reviewing panel says, I just don't think so, it's going to get sent back. Thanks, but no thanks. Same with the court now. So let's talk a little bit more about misconceptions about science. The most common misconception about science is that it only refers to carefully designed laboratory studies where the impact of different variables on some outcome of interest is quantitatively measured and statistically analyzed. Well, there's two methodologies basically, if we just want to be very basic about science. There's a quantitative methodology and a qualitative methodology. Quantitative research involves, well, it's a dominant paradigm, and it involves essentially operational definitions, setting up contrasting circumstances, testing the manner in which one variable impacts on the ones of interest, and then analyzing what happened. Well, can we do that with parental alienation syndrome? No. Okay, you 200 divorcing families that are at each other's throats over here, you 200 divorcing families that are at each other's throats over there. Okay, all you half of you dads, you're going to say mom's a slut every day. Half of you moms, you're going to say dad's a bastard and he's been going out on you forever. You guys, we're going to teach you how to be reasonable. Okay, let's watch what happens over here. Okay, Bill? Well, we can't do that. Now, certainly we can look at cohort studies, but that's a little bit beyond my presentation for today. Qualitative research is a methodology and an approach that focuses on narrative accounts, descriptions, interpretation, context, meaning, and the goal is to describe, interpret, understand the phenomena of interest. Now, according to Professor Kasdan of Yale, qualitative research is an approach to the subject matter of human experience, and it focuses on narrative accounts, description, interpretation, context, meaning. The goal is to describe, interpret, and understand the phenomena of interest. That's where I got that quote. Well, let's see. How does qualitative science work? Well, anthropology. Wait. Let's go back in the time machine and put this Inca village against that Inca village, and we'll vary one variable and we'll see if it... Can't do that. Sociology. Hey, let's go to the football game, and we'll all the people over on this side of the stadium, and can't do that. Social psychiatry, psychology, education, community development, city planning, field biology. Okay, all you gorillas on this side of the valley over there, we're going to paint all the other ones blue. We're going to measure. Can't do that. So, is PAS scientific? Gardner's process over the years has been qualitative research, whereby he systematically and cumulatively described a type of divorce-specific familial interaction, which he properly labeled a syndrome. Gardner was a qualitative researcher. He looked at many, many cases and tried to describe what he saw and tried to describe what was going on. So, are qualitative methods scientific? Yes. Do qualitative methods and PAS meet the Daubert criteria, what's considered to be science? Well, what are they? Testability, falsifiability, error rates, peer review, general acceptance, validity, reliability. Well, what's testability? It's proof by disproof. Can we test ideas about parental alienation? Yeah, sure we can. PAS is certainly testable. Gardner described 8 factors. We can test whether they exist or not. In fact, Bricklin and Elliott are trying to develop inventories that have some inter-rater reliability and some test-retest reliability that can be used in family conflict circumstances. They can certainly test whether those are accurate or not. They can test whether or not they speak to a phenomenon of interest accurately or not. They can test whether or not inter-raters or test-retest find them to be reliable or not. Certainly those concepts are testable when they're operationally defined in that fashion. So Siegel and Langford's study used MMPI-2 personality variables, and they said, this study shows that females who exhibit parental alienation syndrome behaviors are likely to produce extremely defensive MMPI-2 profiles. Now, not just females, remember. Guys are every bit as vicious when they're doing PAS. They appear to respond to the MMPI-2 items in such a way as to appear highly virtuous and without emotional problems or difficulties. Research has shown that most parents being evaluated in the context of custody dispute produce defensive MMPI-2 profiles. The finding that parental alienators answer the test items even more defensively than other parents in custody suits may shed light on their personality tendencies and may be diagnostically useful. Well, that's testing hypotheses about PAS. Falsifiability means, can you set up a hypothesis and falsify it? Now, critics such as Johnston, if anybody understands Johnston's work, you know, surviving the breakup and that sort of thing, and knows what the population was that she was looking at, Corte Madera, Marin County, California, at a particular time period, has a pretty good insight into extrapolations from that data set. Having grown up in a neighboring community and having played high school football against Corte Madera, I would say that they weren't any good. Be that as it may, that's not scientific. Anyway, Johnson said, Gardner has formulated a definition of PAS that includes its hypothesized etiological agents, an alienating parent, and a receptive child. This renders his theory of cause of PAS unfalsifiable because it is tautological. Okay. This portrayal of PAS not being falsifiable misunderstands Gardner's views. Taking his generic observations about common characteristics of PAS phenomena and equating these observations with case-specific diagnoses of PAS based on a comprehensive family evaluation in which a causal connection between the alienator's behavior and a child's system was found. In other words, the idea that a particular parent in a particular case may be inducing PAS is clearly a falsifiable hypothesis, assuming that the alternative explanations were considered as part of the family evaluation process and disproved before the PAS diagnosis was rendered. That wasn't hard. Okay, falsification using case studies. Now, case studies are an important method for falsification in qualitative research and social sciences. The temptation is to just stick with cases that fit the original theory. Falsification utilizing case studies means always looking for the awkward case, always looking for the outlier, searching for new insights and analyzing what is controversial and what may have gone wrong and why. As a behavioral science concept, in the early stages of science, PAS lends itself well to the approach of case study falsification methodology. Error rates. In science, there's no measurement process that doesn't come with error rates, particularly in behavioral sciences. When classifying or predicting some event like PAS, we've got true positives, it's happening. We've got true negatives, not there, Bill, sorry. Dad's just a jerk. I wouldn't want to live with him either. Or false positives, it's happening. And false negatives, nope, not there. But the kids hate him, nope, shut up, not there. But the kids don't, you know, they say these terrible things about him, nope, shut up, not there. Error rates can be described for parental alienation syndrome diagnosis. Error rates for personality tests can be used to establish the likelihood of PAS are available. Error rate of estimations lend themselves readily to rater classification systems, so we could certainly apply an error rate analysis to our predictions or determinations that PAS exists, or that a particular test gives us information about PAS. Okay, what about peer review? Well, if we look at scores and scores and scores of published work in the scientific journals on PAS, or we look at the states in America with the Frye test, PAS admissible, or states in America under the Dauber test, PAS admissible, or provinces in Canada under the Mohan test, PAS admissible, we could certainly say it's met peer review. Series of editors, judges, scientific editors, publication of the work. Yeah, it doesn't mean that it isn't controversial or we're not still trying to move the database forward, but certainly concepts of parental alienation have met the criterion of peer review. It's been peer reviewed. If you look at the work of Dr. Warshak and his statements about PAS, he points to scores and scores and scores of peer review processes about PAS. Okay, error rate, falsification, peer review, yeah, met those. General acceptance, well, we just said that the Mohan test in Canada finds PAS admissible. The Frye test in the United States finds PAS concepts admissible. And PAS under Daubert, here's a Daubert state, Alaska, admissible. Arkansas, admissible. Ohio, admissible. Louisiana, admissible. Wyoming, admissible. Oh, okay, well, so it meets the Daubert criteria, it meets the Frye criteria, it meets the Mohan criteria. Okay, well, that's another check for is PAS scientific. What about validity? Scientific validity is the extent to which a test or a scale measures what it says it's measuring. Are we measuring PAS or are we measuring the Red Wings? Huh? Are we measuring the same thing? Are we measuring PAS or are we predicting how the Maple Leafs are going to do? Huh? I don't know. We've got to be measuring and talking about what we think we're talking about. That's validity. Concepts like internal validity, construct validity. Certainly PAS is a construct. Can we operationally define it? Are we clear and in agreement about that construct's definition? Do we have external validity? Do other people agree? Do we have statistical conclusion validity when we analyze the studies? Well, PAS has gone through that sort of validity analysis again and again and again. Now, Clower and Rivlin were asked to do a study of 700 divorced families for the American Bar Association. They found in 80% of these contested cases alienating processes. They said that there was strong evidence that alienating parent played a primary role in PAS, but the alienating parent's influence was mitigated in cases where the child's time with the target parent was increased. They found 40% of the children developed self-hatred and guilt because they were used as an ally in the war against the rejected parent. Now, this was a study before from many years ago, in 1991, commissioned by the American Bar Association. Reliability. Well, it's another criterion for the evaluation of whether something is scientific or not is reliability. Has PAS been subject to analysis with respect to reliability? I'm sure Dr. Campbell, in our legendary battles. Here's an aside. Dr. Gardner and Dr. Campbell carried on a legendary battle in the journals of science about PAS in the 1980s and early 1990s. And they were bombing. You know, you got the psychiatrist, boom, saying, yes, it is, and it's da-da-da. You got the psychologist, the empiricist saying, show me your data, and da-da-da-da, and so's your old man, and heck with you, and da-da-da-da, and I would talk to Gardner, and steam would be coming out of his ears about this fakakta empiricist Dr. Campbell, and then I'd go and I'd talk to Campbell, and when he wasn't beating me up, he would say, that Gardner, that's his database, I haven't seen any analysis, so I brought them together and bought them drinks and took them to dinner. And the chairman of the Department of Decisional Sciences from Carnegie Mellon University and the head of the psychiatry law program at the University of Michigan graduate faculty were there, and they were and after about 3 drinks, the guys shook hands, hugged each other, and decided that they were a lot closer than they ever thought that they were. Maybe it was a scotch. In any event, in an interesting study by Rueda, designed to test reliability concepts with respect to parental alienation, we find significant concordance among raters that PAS existed. Now, Kopetsky, a social worker off in California, did a whole study about alienating behaviors and saw the same things before she ever knew Gardner existed. Gordon and Stoffli and Bordinelli in 2008, Amy Baker in 2006, published studies about reliability. The results showed strong support for Gardner's definition of PAS. The results revealed distinctive patterns of alienation, publishing reliability studies as well. Now, we have found in the courts of the country, we have found in Saskatchewan just last year, you know, I don't know why you do this. It's real difficult. It's like we're pretending in Canada that we can't really find out who these people are. BSP versus DGP. Okay? Well, in that case, in Saskatchewan, significant parental alienation was discovered. And the judge said, you know what, buddy? This lady is not an alcoholic. She's not a drug addict. She's not a prostitute. She's a warm, loving, caring individual and a mother of 2 teenage children that has been raised, and she's cared for them since birth, except for just the last 16 months when you and her broke up. So you know what, buddy? She's not what you keep telling these children that she is, and you're going to stop it, and I'm going to put the children with her until you get your head out of your armpit. Ontario, just 2007, SP versus PBD. I wanted to include more of these, but I'm dyslexic and I get all of the letters backwards. There's the famous case of R versus P in Alberta. That's a R versus P, 2004. There's the famous case of L versus R. Oh, that's topping our hit parade. From Queen's Bench in Alberta, 2006. There's Pierre Van de Pierre versus Edwards from the Supreme Court of Canada, 2001. There's Tremblay versus Tremblay. I don't know. I guess this Queen's Bench in Alberta wasn't afraid to write their names down. And this was 1987. There's one of my favorites, R versus C, Ontario Supreme Court of Justice, 2002. There's Reeves versus Reeves from Ontario Superior Court of Justice, 2001. Many, many, many additional cases in Canada where judges are getting it and saying, you know what, buddy, you're going to stop saying that crap to the kids about their mom, and you're going to be off in the wings until mom and the kids have a chance to normalize a relationship. Or, you know what, ma'am, this stuff about abuse has got to stop because you're starting to get the kids to believe it, and nobody else does, and you're making them crazy, so we're going to hold you off in the wings until we get this worked out. And then in the United States, a famous case where the judge said, like Medea, she is ready to sacrifice her child to accomplish her selfish goal. In Florida, in Iowa, in New York, another case in Iowa, Indiana, another one in New York, 1999, New York City, 2007, Maryland, 2008. Many, many, many PAS cases working their way into courts where the courts say, this is parental alienation syndrome, this is parental alienation disorder, this is parental alienation, I don't care what you call it, this is going to stop. The important thing for you to take away from this discussion is that parental alienation certainly can be seen to have scientific underpinnings. Parental alienation certainly can be seen to meet all of the criteria more in better or worse ways depending upon what data set you look at. Testability, falsifiability, error rate analysis, validity, reliability, that courts think is what covers the waterfront with respect to science. Why do we care? Why do we care? We care for two reasons. One, we care because the people say, "That's not scientific, it's junk science, and you're just trying to put the kid with the abuser. I can tell because the Leadership Council told me so." Okay. Let's look closely at what underpins that kind of an opinion. Well, we've looked at Sherry Wood. She doesn't even understand base rate. We've looked at Carol Brooks. She thinks that the appropriate citation for a scientific analysis is a newspaper. And we looked at Kathleen Fowler, and despite what she writes about, when you look at what she actually does in a PAS case, in a false allegation case, it's horrific. Okay. We care because one side or the other is going to say, well, forget about what's happening to the children. This is stupid. This is a ridiculous conceptualization. Forget about it. No, we're not going to talk about what's happening to kids. No, I'm not listening. Because it's junk science. Ah! And you don't find folks that say that actually looking carefully at the methodology of the analysis that came to that opinion. So we care about whether PAS is scientific because people try to change the argument away from helping the kids by saying it's a junk science concept when it isn't. And we care about it because as we can determine that it has an ability to be, that the concept has an ability to be scrutinized with the procedures, the principles and methodology of science, we can come to see it as a valid concept. We can come to see it as a reliable concept. We can come to see it as having some predictive weight. I had the honor of going to dinner night before last with Barry Bricklin, who's been trying to do, and Gail Elliott, who've been trying to do stuff with high conflict divorces for decades. And after Bricklin had about 3 drinks, he was telling me about his contact with Einstein back in the day. He's about 600 years old. And he was telling me, you know, all science really boils down to is attempts at better description and better prediction. So the second reason we care about PAS being scientific is because it tells us that if we don't interdict this process, if we don't stop this, our sons and our daughters are going to be crippled in their object relations, in their ability to get along in the world, in their ability to have good relationships with the opposite sex. And that is the most important reason of all. Thank you.
What's being done with this, with the reformulation of the PAS model, which I went on and on about last night. What's your opinion about that? I think the evaluations I read now are different than the ones I read 5, 10 years ago, in that they've gotten more in the middle of the road, less focused on the alienating parents' behavior, and that impacts the solution about what's.
Okay, the question is, do I have an opinion about the way in which evaluations and reports about parental alienation seem to be developing? They seem to be more middle of the road, more mamby-pamby, less. My opinion about that is that the people that are not confronting the tremendous inertia in the courts in Canada and in the United States lack intestinal fortitude, lack the courage of their convictions, lack a burning sense that they're in a helping profession to actually help children get through terrible circumstances, and that we should be jacking them up at every opportunity. That's my sense of it. Yes?
I find it interesting that our field, and I understand this, is kind of gravitating towards a Dahlberg standard in terms of admissibility evidence and ways of backing up scientific support. And it seems like we're doing this kind of in a defensive posture because there are so many things such as fingerprinting, eyewitness reports and all that are admitted in evidence every day that never met a Dahlberg standard. And I want your opinion on that in terms of, you know, in a funny way, are we even kind of setting ourselves up by saying that that has to be a standard when a good part of what's admitted in court never met a Dahlberg standard? So I'm just kind of curious of your thought on that.
Well, okay. The question goes to the issue of why are we subjecting parental alienation syndrome, parental alienation expert testimony to a high standard of scrutiny before it's admissible when there are many kinds of so-called scientific theories, fingerprints, bullet lead analysis, eyewitness identification that haven't been subjected to the same level of scrutiny. My sense is, so what? Let's do the hard thing. In order for me to, I practice all over the United States. I consult on cases in Canada. In order to practice all over the United States, the California bar is the hardest to pass. The New York bar is the next hardest to pass. I made certain that I was licensed in both California and New York because I want to go to other places. And if I can pass the hardest tests, well, okie dokie. And so if PAS can be scrutinized, and the people are supposed to testify it under the strictest tests that we have available, let's not get down there in the silliness with the lab at Quantico that has to say, oops, sorry, all those wrongfully convicted guys, I guess bullet lead analysis really is stupid, and we didn't have a database. You had a question?
Well, yeah, my question was, when you talk about scientific and that, and the acceptance of this kind of expert testimony or the information from this.
Well, okay. If you get a jerk for a judge, there's almost nothing you can do. These are very difficult cases. It's easy to be a jerk with these kinds of cases because they're so high energy, high conflict, with lots of competing claims. I tell clients in the cases that I do that I consult on in Canada and that I do across the United States that a custody case is a beauty contest. You know, you've got evening wear, you know, you've got swimsuits, you know, you've got talent. It's a beauty contest. Whoever puts on the best show with the best talent and the best outfits and the best presentation is going to win. So if you've got an attorney that really understands this syndrome and really understands proof and how to develop proof and can really put a good show together, you're going to win. And if you don't, you're going to lose. It doesn't matter how polarized things are. It just, in the context of an extremely full docket of parents and children screaming and hollering and fighting with one another, your trier of fact is so overwhelmed usually that it's going to come down to the show. So that's what will win a case, and that's what will lose a case. Anything else? Sir?
I do battle with these folks equally, Barbara. They cut and paste from all their own sites, and you'll find that when you go to one site, you can find the identical information on another site. Liz's library is another one where she has got all this information, and it's all bogus. But what I do with them is
well, yes, it does get circular and they quote each other. But remember, just because you're quoting each other doesn't mean you're wrong. The harder thing to do, of course, and I know that you want to do that, is, and that's why I made this presentation for you, is to look at what they actually say and follow it back to what they actually think. And if you can, find out what they actually do. What do they do? You know, I mean, it was a marvelous thing to be able to look at a detractor who says PAS doesn't exist, doing a high-profile, high-conflict parental alienation case. What did she actually do, and what do totally independent reviewers say about what they do, and how do they think, and what do they know, and what do they cite to? You know, you've got You've got Sauber publishing, being the editor of a journal that absolutely insists on rigorous peer review and insists on your citations being peer reviewed and of value in the scientific community. Or you can't get to first base with him. And if you compare the level of quality of the analysis to stuff like that, you see that scientists don't always agree, but they sure get enthusiastic about arguing and screaming and hollering with each other and insisting on data and insisting on sources and evaluation of data and analysis of data. And these other folks, they're just in sort of a circle, you know what, and reinforcing each other. Anything else? Sir?
You had in your presentation talked a little bit about dealing with the sexual abuse allegations. Do you have any suggestions on dealing with domestic violence, which at least in countries like Canada is almost a knee-jerk legal reaction?
Well, there should be a knee-jerk legal reaction to domestic violence, and the reason is because it's extremely dangerous for police officers, law enforcement personnel, and it's insidious. In the minority of domestic violence cases, it's horrible, terrible, ongoing emotional and physical suffering. In the majority of the cases, it's people shoving each other around. In another minority of the cases, it's completely bogus and ridiculous. And somebody goes, I had a case where a woman decided that she was going to get my client a motorcycle, a skilled tradesman and a motorcycle repairman, convicted or at least arrested for felonious assault, intent to commit murder, so on and so forth. So she ran and bashed her face into the cupboard, and her girlfriend was there and took pictures of it, and then they rouged it all up, and then they invited the guy over and called the cops, and did this again at another circumstance. And so there were 3 kids involved, and we went through a year-long process with the criminal courts and with the family law courts. And because she was very pretty and she'd been an exotic dancer, she got a very snooty law firm, the kind of people who believe that when they poop, it comes out in a little box, gift wrapped, you know, and to represent her pro bono. This was their pro bono activity. We're so relevant, and so I went into the deposition and I said, this is a community property state, and I wanted to make sure that we understood each other. I said, this is a community property state, and I want one of them back. And he goes, I beg your pardon? I said, my client, he wants one of those back. Whatever could you be talking about? Well, she had breast enhancement surgery to improve her career. We want one of them back. And he was... When the dust settled, Dad got the kids, Mom was put into counseling, and we got the girlfriend to testify against her that this is the kind of stuff that she was pulling. But it took forever and a tremendous amount of effort, this guy's bill got so high that if I ever get a motorcycle, if I ever get a Harley Davidson, I can have it repaired, rebuilt, remodeled for the rest of my natural life. But at least the kids are doing well. So it takes a lot of work to demonstrate that some phony domestic violence accusations are in fact phony and they're contrived. And judges are not willing to listen to that unless you have a very good case and you make a very good presentation about it. Anything else? Sir?
You did work for $2. I'd like to offer you $50 with inflation.
Well, you know, my staff. I have a great big office manager who handles all of this kind of stuff, and he doesn't let me do things like that anymore. But yes, ma'am.
In terms of the legal system with this, in some areas of Canada, we don't necessarily have an evidentiary standard in family law. We have a balanced probability standard.
Right.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah. A probability standard is a good standard if you're using probability and a balance of probability standard to demonstrate what is a predictive validity and the predictive reliability of assessments of PAS. In other words, okay, do we have it or don't we have it? What is descriptive validity? What's the probability that we're accurate that it in fact exists? Okay, we've got it. What's the probability that we're accurate with respect to how severe it is? Okay. and what's the probability, what's the predictive probability of what's going to happen to the kids if we don't do something differently. That's the game I play in those jurisdictions.
What if those probabilities are actually based on previously flawed research decisions, reports?
You need to go back and unwind them. And sometimes the only way you can go back and unwind them is to bring the people in that wrote them and examine them. Do it in depositions, do it orally or in writing. They tend to fudge in writing. I tend to try to, like put them on with a pin and a cushion, and then force them to read things that Dr. Bone and Jane Major and Dr. Campbell and Dr. Sauber have written and explain to me how their findings comport with the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And first of all, find out if they even knew about it, because they usually don't. Sir?
Is there a statistic probability that children who grow up with their fathers don't do well in society? Or why isn't that just enough to get joint parenting in?
Well, there's a very good book by Michael Lamb, published back in the 80s, called Father Absence. And it brings together, or at the time it brought together, decades of research about how kids do when dad's not around. Hetherington, Cox, and Cox were premier authors in the field. And there's a great deal of statistical data about how kids do without a dad, without a father figure. And that's certainly a good place to start to make those kinds of cases. What's going to happen to the kids if dad's not around? What's going to happen to the kids if mom's not around? It's a rarer circumstance when mom isn't around, but certainly that has its corresponding difficulties. But Hetherington, Cox and Cox are authors in that field. You can Google them. And Michael Lamb wrote the book called Father Absence.
Well, we know the data's there, but why isn't there enough push to say, listen, the society's going to hell without fathers back in kids' lives, and needs to get the legislation changed. I don't know why isn't that information there? You have to put a number on it and say it's statistically serious?
No.
I'm aware of the data.
Beauty contest. Evening wear. Talent. It's the presentation that you make and how much inertia you blow out of the way that's in case after case after case that's going to get things to change. The legislature is not likely to drive the courts. It's the courts and the court cases that's likely to drive the legislature and get things to change. So you've got to make more and more presentations with lawyers that know what they're doing and experts that can explain it to the courts to get things to change. Sir?
Somewhat related to the last question, do you have any experience or can you comment on if a judge is going to be at all concerned, or any professional is going to be at all concerned about the lack of a parent, whether it's a father or a mother, in a child's life, in a conflict case or otherwise? Do you have any experience, or can you comment on the replacement of the biological parent, father or mother, with the next married spouse, the replacement parent?
Yeah, that's a real whipsaw, isn't it? On one hand, to have a two-parent household, it's better usually than a one-parent household because of the shared responsibilities and usually the different sex roles that are played. However, when the kid's sense of who their mom is whipsawed by somebody that dad says, no, this is your mom, it fosters confusion and identity diffusion. And that should always be stopped. If there's any way to bring that to the attention of the courts, it should be done frequently, it should be done immediately and frequently. And the only way to stop it is to have some enforcement tied to it and to keep the disenfranchised parent in the kids' lives. Even if you're in an orbit around the newly constructed nuclear family, that orbit should come close to that nuclear family every once in a while, and its apogee and perigee, and make a big impact on them. Hey, remember me? Etc. If at the absolute least. And so bring it up immediately, bring it up frequently, make certain that there's a methodology for interaction. Do the best you can to make friends with your replacement. Okay, I have one more question. Yes?
I want to make a comment. I'm the mother of 2 severely alienated boys, and in the 3.5 years that I've been trying to get somewhere with getting myself back into their lives, I've seen numerous therapists, numerous lawyers, of course, all of them having their feet. The recent cases that have done well, and I'm very glad that they did well, and the target parent won custody, but these were people that had financial needs to continually pay. For those of us that work regular jobs and would have the ability to pay, these therapists and these lawyers that ongoing, it seems like it's a never-ending fund for them. And I've had 2 assessments done, both coming back with the same result, that it was PAS. And yet, when I went to another lawyer, they said a year later that those assessments were too old to be worth anything, so I had to have another assessment done. It's like, how many assessments need to be done when, it's not a never-ending fund, is what I'm saying. I would work 3 jobs if I had to, but money is not limitless.
Of course.
The fact that all these lawyers, you say, you need a lawyer, you need a therapist, you need a psychologist,
You need to do the beauty contest. Yeah. Okay, so what do you do when you don't have the financial resources to bring the circus to town? What you do is you file the papers, you get into court, you say, I don't have the resources to bring the circus to town. Here it is. You didn't do anything. It got worse. What are you going to do now? The next month, I don't have the resources to bring the circus to town. I'm back here. Such and such has happened since the last time I asked you to do something. Nothing has happened. There's been no enforcement of the order. What are you going to do now? Back the next month. I asked you last month and the month before that. Nothing has happened. What are you going to do now? And be back there every single time, as polite as possible. This is what you said. This is what happened. There were no consequences. What are you going to do about it?
Previously, before the last time I was in court, I had funds available for lawyers and therapists, but the last time I was in court, I was ordered to pay child support, or not to see my children. And so in order to continue to pay therapists and lawyers, and, it's just, I will take your advice.
Right. Well, they're bringing you into the low-stakes table in the casino, and and they're keeping you in there, but you're at the nickel slots, aren't you? Well, poop on the chair. Come on, do something. Thank you very much.
I want to thank our keynote speaker today, Dr. Demosthenes Lorandos, one of the giants in advancing the science of psychology and parental alienation syndrome. Thank you so much, Dr. Lorandos, for presenting here today.